So good afternoon, everyone. A warm welcome to all of you. First of all, let me thank Dr. Gagandeep for agreeing to give this talk. Right, we're really honored to have you here. She doesn't really need an introduction, right? But I will still point out a few things. So Dr. Gagandeep, as you all know, she's a renowned Indian physician, scientist, and clinical microbiologist, right? And she works in the area of enteric diseases, vaccinology, and public health. She has an MBBS, MD in microbiology, and then PhD from Christian Medical College, Vellore. And of course, has held a lot of prominent academic and leadership positions, including, at CMC Vellore, the professor of microbiology, and she was also the executive director at THTSI from 2016 to 2020. She's known for her work in the rotavirus area, and a lot of her work essentially led to the rotavirus vaccines that were adopted, 2 Indian-made rotavirus vaccines, including the Rotavac. And besides her work in vaccine development, she's played a key role in building various surveillance systems and clinical trials. So currently, she's involved with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and she leads, she's the director of enterics, diagnostics, genomics, and epidemiology at the Gates Foundation. And she has numerous awards to her credit, the Infosys Prize being, one of them, the Canada Gardenia Global Health Award. And she was also the first Indian woman to be elected as a fellow of the Royal Society. So with that, I think, I'll hand over the mic to Dr. Kang to give us this talk on global health research from India.
So thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk here. I'm actually supposed to be visiting faculty at IIT, so I don't think I come here often enough. But what I've seen and heard today makes me really enthusiastic about coming back as soon as possible. So hopefully I'll get to spend more time hearing about all of the exciting things that you are doing. And I hope that I will feature you in a talk that is titled Global Health Research from India for the World pretty soon. But what I'm going to talk to you about today actually starts from my own medical education and then goes backwards to the history of what has been done in India in 3 specific areas. There are many ways I could have done this, but this was what I decided to do, to talk about when you think about health. One of the things when you go to medical school, and I know there are a few doctors here, the one thing that we are told is that good doctors need to focus on clinical service, that you need to be seeing patients, you need to be attending to them as quickly as possible. Research is a luxury. It is for other people in other parts of the world to do. And there are people who have gone against that paradigm, and I will tell you about 3 of them today. But this is the structure of the talk. You can see it's going to focus mostly on enteric infections, but we will do cholera in eastern India. We will do polio and rotavirus vaccines from the south and the north. Now, I'm retired now. And when I first joined medicine, it was in 1981. In 1981, the big thing in community health was something that the WHO CRO had recommended for medical education, which was called Rural Orientation of Medical Education, or the ROAM program. Now, why do you think they did that? And if you think about the world and you think about all the medical colleges that you know now, most of them are in cities. Most of them are associated with big hospitals. When you work in a big hospital, the cases that you see are complicated. They are not the common problems that we encounter with our health, right? We don't know how to treat people in rural areas. We frequently don't know how to treat common ailments. We don't know when to hold back, because most of the patients that we have seen have really had very severe disease because they came to the big hospital and they had to be pretty sick to be there and be an inpatient that we could examine as medical students. So what's CRO recommended at the time was, can we shift medical teaching? Can we take teaching out of the hospitals, the big hospitals, and put it in places where the bulk of disease really is? So in CMC, it was one of the few places that took this very, very seriously. They decided that they were really going to set up different models of community care. And what they did was they set up 3 different models. The most intensive one was one where every village had a part-time community health worker. Now, if you remember your grandparents' time, your great-grandparents' time, there used to be a lot of births used to happen at home. And the person who was responsible for attending to that birth, thank you. That's okay, I'm old enough to not care. But when births used to happen at home, you had a traditional birth attendant who would come home and deliver the baby there. Most of them were untrained. Most of them, the idea of hygiene was a new blade to cut the umbilical cord. The traditional way of purifying the umbilical cord was to smear gobar on it. And that meant that you had a lot of infections that happened in both mothers and in babies. So our program actually took these guys, the traditional birth attendants, and trained them so that there was one in every village. Then we took a girl who had finished school and made her into a health aide. You had to have people who were able to read and write and keep records in those villages. So 5,000 population was covered by one health aide. Then you had a community health nurse who was responsible for a number of health aides, and above them you had a doctor responsible for a population of about 100,000 people. So this was a model that fed into an 80-bed hospital, and it was really around maternal and child health. We had another model, which was the Rural Unit for Health and Social Affairs. And this was, we will not only look after health, we will also look after the community in terms of agriculture, animal husbandry. We provide training so that there are economic opportunities for people there. And the third model was, CMC will not do anything. When the government asks us for help, we will go and help in that primary health center or in that block. So we had these 3 models, and for medical students, what you were required to do in your first year was go and spend 3 weeks in the village. You were trained in how to collect data. So anybody know the concept of dry land and wetland? Dry land is unirrigated land, wetland is irrigated land. Not hard to figure out, but it's not something that most medical students who come from cities would know without knowing how to ask for it. So whether it was which caste do you belong to, do you live in the main village or the Harijan colony, how much dry land, how much wetland you have, where is your toilet, is it inside the house, is it outside the house? These were the kinds of data that we were taught to collect. When you start to collect that data, you then begin to build a picture of the community that you are actually serving. And for most of us, when we see patients in hospital, is that what we are bothered about? For me, Christian Medical College is a mission hospital that has grown into a medical college. For the longest time, and I must admit I'm Punjabi, so a little bit slow for many things, I couldn't figure out why there were so many pawn shops, right? PAWN shops outside the hospital. It was only when you start to talk to communities, you figure out that people are actually selling jewelry to be able to pay for patients in the hospital. So these kinds of understanding are things that ordinarily in our medical education we never consider. So I'm showing you here pictures from the 1980s. This was our 80-bedded hospital. This is the first part-time community health worker that we had, the Dai, who learned how to tell us about which women are pregnant, which child is sick, who needs to be looked after. In the pink saris, we have our health aides, who are the women who look after 5, 6 part-time community health workers. And in the blue sari, probably showing up as white here, is a woman who is a community health nurse. So she looks after a population of 30,000 people, is the one responsible for verbal autopsies. So when a child or a parent, if anyone dies in her community, she goes and asks them and tries to ascertain the cause of death, in addition to monitoring what is happening to all of them. I mentioned the rural unit for health and social affairs. Among the agriculture and animal husbandry, one of the things that we taught women how to do was to be welders and car mechanics so that they could have employment. It got to such a stage where the men sort of picked up on this and said, why are you training the women? This is the training we need too. So these were the kinds of interventions that the community health department did, which you never hear about in a medical college or hospital. So our teaching was in the community. So you learn to have focus group discussions. You talk to the men and the women separately. If you need to weigh a child, you do it under a tree. And you do a lot of community visits at home. And what that tells you ultimately is that when you look at the burden of common illnesses, right? Common is really common. I don't think you're going to be able to read anything from the back of the room. So I will tell you that this is a picture of what were the deaths in 1990 in children under the age of 5 years globally. This is lower respiratory tract infections. This is diarrhea. So you can see the orientation of these two. This is that same graph, children under 5, global picture. This is lower respiratory tract. This is lower respiratory tract infections. This is diarrhea. Can we see the difference from 1990 to 2021? Obviously, these two infectious causes of death have really shrunk. Diarrhea, very common problem. Infections, respiratory infections in children, also very common. Now you take that figure and you break it down in 2021 by countries that have a low social development index or a high social development index. These are poor countries, these are rich countries. Let's take a look at rich countries' diarrhea and lower respiratory infections. This is lower respiratory tract infections in rich countries. This is the whole global picture. This is diarrhea globally. This is diarrhea deaths in high income countries. So obviously, if these are the world and rich countries, what you've got is poor countries. And in poor countries, LRIs and diarrhea continue to be very, very large causes of death. So what does this mean? Are high income countries worried about diarrhea? Are we worried about diarrhea? We should be. I don't know that we are worried about it. So this is just to tell you that if you study health, the gut is at the center of it all. If your gut is not in good shape, you are not in good shape, right? And particularly in developing countries, the role of the gut as an organ that is not sterile, that acts as a passageway for many kinds of infections and many things that cause inflammation is really, really important. So gut health truly matters, and we probably don't have it very well. Why is that? Because these are the environments in which the bulk of people who are disadvantaged live. We don't have proper toilets, we don't have proper drainage systems, we have traditional practices that lead to, things like using cow dung to purify your home, which is fine when it's dry, I'm sure, but when it rains, what you wind up with is a slurry. You also have flooding. You have a lot of people crowded into one space where cooking and sleeping and everything happens together. So these are not the best environments to protect you from infections. And there have been many studies that have looked at diarrhea, resulting in things like the IHME estimates. But we also know from the studies that we've done, and these are data from a study called the Global Enterics Multi-Site Study, that diarrhea can be caused by many things. There are about 400 relatively common causes of diarrhea. But if you look at children, this is a study that was done in 7 countries in children under 5 with a case control design. And if you look at the figure that is in pink, that is the best available methods around 2005, 2006. And then in the blue is the best available methods, quantitative PCR done about 8 to 10 years ago. What it essentially shows you is that rotavirus was your number 1 cause of diarrhea, severe diarrhea, in children under 5 in this study, whichever method you used. If you look at the other figures, you see that adenovirus 4041 comes up when you use a molecular approach, but doesn't apply with the original microbiology. Cryptosporidium, a parasite, stays about the same, and then there are variations across all of these. So what this is to point out is that, diarrhea is important in developing countries, in children, and the most important cause of diarrhea in children tends to be rotavirus. Now, if you look at this figure, what you see here is that cholera looks pretty small, but Southeast Asia is the home of cholera. Why is cholera so small in a study like this? Any guesses? Sorry? Undersampling. Cholera is a disease that does not affect children alone. It affects adults as well, right? And cholera occurs as outbreaks. This was a study that was set up to be a case control design at facilities. So anything that was going to cause large outbreaks and was going to affect a lot of people wasn't necessarily going to show up in this kind of study. But we know that cholera is important. I'm not handing out prizes, but if I was to ask you which state in India has the most cholera, anybody willing to make a guess? So the Bay of Bengal is the place that is supposed to be the home of cholera. Most of, well, the last pandemic of cholera, which is still ongoing, actually originated from there and has spread around the globe. Bangladesh and West Bengal have outbreaks of cholera every year. Every time there is flooding, you start to see cases of cholera. And some of that is related to where cholera can hide in the inter outbreak periods, which is essentially in plankton that can grow well when the sea comes into the land. Cholera is a vibrio, a halophilic organism, a salt-loving organism. So wherever there is a border near an ocean, those are the kinds of places where you will see a lot of cholera. Now, cholera is a disease where outbreaks in India have been described for thousands of years, outbreaks of diarrheal disease. The fact that it was cholera, we didn't know until the end of the 19th century. But once cholera had been, Vibrio cholerae had been identified as a cause of cholera, we started to understand much more about the disease and look for it much better. Now, in Kolkata, we have a center that is established by the Indian Council for Medical Research that used to be known as the National Cholera Research Center, then became the National Institute of Cholera and Enteric Diseases. And working there in the we think that basic science studies never come out of India, important findings never come out of India. This is a forgotten hero, a man called Shambhunath De, who was working as a scientist at the Cholera Research Center. And in 1959, he showed that it wasn't the bacteria that were infecting individuals, infecting the gut to produce disease. Vibrio cholerae was producing a toxin, and it was that toxin that was responsible for the diarrhea that we saw in cholera. He did a number of studies that were in rabbit models and demonstrated this. Other people then started to come to Calcutta and Dhaka, people from the US mainly, and they continued to do more research on cholera there with Indian and Bangladeshi investigators. And what they were able to show was the mechanism of action of cholera, but they were also then interested in figuring out how to treat it. Now, the original treatment for cholera was to give intravenous rehydration because people had tried to give fluids, right? You're replacing fluid because in cholera you can lose up to about 20 to 35 liters of fluid in a 12-hour period, right? That's like having stool that fills a bucket. So people had tried it, it didn't work. The only thing that was working was intravenous rehydration. There were people that were working on, can we make this into oral rehydration? And what they managed to figure out was that what happens with the cholera toxin is that you have chloride secretion into the gut, and that leads to loss of both water and sodium. But if you look at the gut, sodium and glucose are actually transported together when it is a question of absorption. So if you have glucose in the gut, sodium will get absorbed. And that really is the basis of oral rehydration solution. You know that oral rehydration solutions can be made at home. Just giving salt water is not enough, but salt and sugar in water results in our ability to rehydrate individuals. And that's because of the sodium glucose transporter. Now, this work was done in Kolkata and in Dhaka, but the person who really proved that this was something that could be done at scale was someone who took these very early lab findings. And in 1971, Bangladesh's War of Independence was also associated with a humongous cholera outbreak, both in Bangladesh and in India. And it just wasn't possible to put IVs for every patient, especially in those camps where so many people were displaced. So Dilip Malinobis, who was working in those frontline camps, decided to make a homemade solution of ORS and started to give it to people so that it wasn't necessary to have IVs all the time. So being able to rehydrate people orally saved thousands of lives during that and has continued to be a mainstay of rehydration in cholera epidemics. Now, Dilipda died before he got his Padma Vibhushan award, but he was recognized with the Magsaysay award during his lifetime. Now, switching back to living environments, cholera also is determined by the environment, but coming to chronic disease is, I just want to show you this picture of how the gut can be damaged. Now, if you look at a healthy gut, what you have as an absorptive surface is villi. And villi are typically supposed to be finger-like. Now, finger-like villi have lots of surface area, so they can absorb things that they need to be absorbing. But if you get damage to your gut, celiac disease, other kinds of conditions, what happens to these fingers is they become like that. They become short and squat, and that is a condition that we call environmental enteropathy. You've been infected so many times that your gut gets damaged and your villi no longer have the nice, clean, finger-like structure. They become more like big fat leaves. So when that happens in children, a lot of other things happen as well. And this is just an example of data from children in Vellore, where we compared children who were living, basically doctors' children, because you can, if you work in CMC, you can get hold of your colleagues who have young kids and sample their stools. But you also had study children that were in the kinds of environments I showed you. And if these are doctors' children, Indian doctors' children who look completely healthy, don't have diarrhea, have one bug in their stool per gram. If you look at kids who are in the urban slums in Vellore, they have, looking completely healthy, 4 bugs in their stool at the same time. But if you also look at how much inflammation there is in their gut, and fecal calprotectin is something that we use to monitor inflammatory bowel disease, the levels of fecal calprotectin are higher in normal looking children in Vellore than there are in people who have things like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. That's how much inflammation is going on, but the kids look healthy. So if you take a look at these 2 children, they both look healthy and happy. They come to our clinics, but the child that is supposed to be 102 centimeters tall is actually only 92 centimeters. So lost 10 centimeters in height by the age of 4 years. So what happens with environmental enteropathy? Your gut is damaged, you don't absorb nutrients, you don't grow well. And while you can look at a starving child, acute malnutrition, and see that something is wrong, when a child is just short, you don't know that anything is wrong with them. And this is the kind of thing that we should be thinking and worrying about, because in the studies that we have done, What we've shown is that if you look at urban slums in southern India, nowadays 30% of children are stunted. The median IQ of people around the world is 100. The median IQ in slums is 89. So they're already damaged just by being in that environment. And if you take the people in the slums and look at the ones that are persistently stunted, their IQs are even lower. So you can imagine if you have a 15-point difference in your IQ, how much of a difference that makes to your future productivity. And these are the things we don't think about when we think of enteric infections. So in the work that we've done, we've tried to correlate all the factors that lead to environmental entropy, and we've thought a lot about its consequences. And the foundation, the Gates Foundation, has been very interested in the idea of growth and resilience to support optimal growth and development. So basically, the idea is, if you are well nourished, live in a good household, if you get sick, you'll go back to normal. But if you are on a trajectory that is going down and you get multiple hits, you actually don't go back up, you just go further down. So how do you think about countering those? Now, this is still a problem that we are continuing to look at, but in the meantime, we've also thought about other things that happen because of gut damage. One example of consequences of gut damage is actually polio. Anybody taken the oral polio vaccine? All of you, I hope. So, how do we give oral polio vaccines? Obviously, orally, but have you heard of national immunization days? Have you heard announcements where people tell you that you should bring all children under 5 to place X or Y to get them immunized? Yeah, they don't do that in the West. Even in places that used oral polio vaccines, they don't do that. Now, polio is a very old disease, right? It's been with us for many years, and we're trying now to eradicate polio. Not happening. We are approximately, I think, 25 years late and about $35 billion over budget by one estimate. But basically, if you look at what happens in the US when you give doses of vaccine, and these are seroconversion rates, what percentage of children seroconvert? What you can see here is after you've got 3 doses of vaccine in the US, to poliovirus 1, poliovirus 2, poliovirus 3, the 3 viruses in the vaccines, pretty much everybody has seroconverted. If you look in developing countries, what you see is that there is no perfect seroconversion. It's 73, 90, and 70. Poliovirus 2 is the best of the strongest virus out of the 3, and the other 2 don't convert as well. What that actually means is that when you look at the efficacy of the vaccine, each dose is giving you about 13% efficacy. This is based on data that were from northern Uttar Pradesh in the early 2000s. Now, coming to Shambhunath Dey and Dilip Malinobis, I've told you about. Now I'm going to tell you about a person from CMC. This is Dr. T. Jacob John, who worked on polio for his whole life. And in the 1970s, he showed that if you looked at kids in rural and urban areas, 1 in 25 children in urban areas and 1 in about 30 children in rural areas actually had poliovirus in their stools. This is the 1970s. Oral polio vaccines were developed early in the 1960s, used around the world. They came to India 20 years later, in the early 1980s, after India adopted the EPI program and started to be used. But even in the mid and late 1980s, when you had children with paralytic poliomyelitis, many of them had received their 3 doses of vaccine. So what was going on? What was going on was what I showed you in the previous slide, that 70% of kids were responding to vaccine with 3 doses, which still meant that 30% were not protected against polio. So that's why we saw kids with paralytic poliomyelitis that had been fully immunized by Western standards. So what Dr. John showed was that Indian kids needed about 6 doses of OPV to get protection. And it took almost 10 years of us using polio vaccines. And only when we introduced more than 3 doses, cases of polio started to go down. So he also showed that if you gave the entire community polio vaccine at the same time, entire community children under 5, by a process called pulse immunization, that resulted in a reduction of polio cases in the community. So we needed more doses of vaccine for the vaccine to work and prevent paralytic poliomyelitis. Now, Dr. John's work resulted in what were called national immunization days and sub-national immunization days. So these are data from 1998 to 2010, but what I want to show you is really this. These in black are national immunization days, in blue are sub-national immunization days. And what you can see here in the green is mop-up campaigns. But this is the amount of immunization it took for the polio program to be able to overcome the effect of damaged guts, right? So if you live in an environment that is challenging, you need many, many more doses of vaccine. And Rukhsar Khatun was the last case of wild polio virus seen in India, and she was an unimmunized child at the time that she developed paralysis. So in India now, we don't have polio, but we have polio in neighboring countries, in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. And there are other countries that have vaccine-derived poliovirus that circulates. So there have been a lot of studies in Vellore that have been done using the injectable polio vaccine, which induces an immune response even in children with malnourished guts. So Dr. John's push now is for as many countries as possible to switch to the IPV exclusively and take away the OPV that is causing the circulating vaccine-derived polioviruses. We have not yet reached that point in India, but hopefully it will happen. So just building on that, the performance of oral vaccines, we learned from polio, but we know that now other vaccines don't perform as well either. And the one I'm going to talk to you now about is the rotavirus vaccine. I hope I convinced you earlier with the histogram that rotavirus is the most important cause of diarrhea. It causes dehydrating gastroenteritis, but this is the description I love about rotavirus. It's a democratic virus. It affects rich and poor. You know, you can be very focused on hygiene and it will delay the virus for a little while, but sooner or later, everyone pretty much is going to get the virus. And really, it's a virus that causes dehydration very quickly and winds up killing a lot of people. So I'm going to show you this map here. And this is a map in 1998. So before rotavirus vaccines, what did diarrheal diseases as a cause of death really look like? So this is what was the picture. Yet when the first rotavirus vaccine was made, it was introduced first in the US. I'm looking at the map and there's a disconnect there. Children are dying somewhere, vaccine is being given somewhere else. Why is that? They made the vaccine first. That's true. Well, rotavirus is a cause of severe diarrhea, right? Severe diarrhea leads to children being hospitalized. When children are hospitalized, their parents have to look after them. When their parents are looking after their children in the hospital, they're not going to work. So there is a cost to even diseases that do not kill. So if there is a cost-effective vaccine, and rotavirus vaccine was cost-effective for the US, they introduced the vaccine first. The vaccine had a side effect, it was withdrawn, new vaccines were made. The side effect was intussusception, a telescoping of the gut into itself. So it needed for new, safer vaccines to be made. So they did these trials on very, very large studies, 60 to 70,000 children. But they found no intussusception. But when the vaccine had to be introduced, the vaccine cost $200 to immunize a child. Today, the rotavirus vaccine in the US is even more expensive. Depending on which vaccine you're using, you pay between $220 and $240 to immunize one child. In India, can we pay that cost for our children? We have 25 million children born every year. If we used up that kind of money for vaccines, we wouldn't have money for anything else. So these vaccines were introduced into the Indian market at a lower cost, but still pretty expensive. This was in the private market. And obviously, it was very clear that the Indian public health program was not going to be able to pay for these vaccines. We knew that the vaccines that were available in the West were very good vaccines. They had 85 and 95% efficacy. And these were made by well-reputed companies, GSK and Merck. And the Indian Academy of Pediatrics recommended that children get these vaccines. But IAP recommendations apply to the private market and not to the public market. Yet we had been doing surveillance for rotavirus, and we knew that 2 out of 5 children hospitalized for diarrhea in India had rotavirus infections. We had in fact done very detailed estimates of disease burden that showed us that 1 in 2 children had rotavirus infection, and 1 in 650 children at that time, 15 years ago, were dying because of a rotavirus gastroenteritis. So given this kind of disease burden, we needed a vaccine. But the question was, can we have a vaccine that will work? Polio didn't work in our population. Would a rotavirus vaccine work? And could we afford it? So there was a study that was going on with the first rotavirus vaccine that was stopped. And the person who was leading that effort was actually somebody very familiar to the Indian science community in his later years, Dr. Raj Bhan, who was secretary of the Department of Biotechnology, but he actually started as a pediatrician. And in 1985, WHO sent him kits, ELISA kits, for looking for rotavirus. And he needed a ready source of stool samples. So where do you find stool samples of children in hospital? He wanted negative control, so he went to the neonatal ICU and he picked up stool samples, rectal swabs from children there, and tested them in this new ELISA kit and found positive. So first he thought there was a problem with the kit. Then he actually had someone run a gel and figured out that there really was rotavirus in those stool samples. These children had asymptomatic infections. But he didn't stop there. He actually followed up the children, found that the ones that had the neonatal infections had less diarrhea, and then developed this particular vaccine as a vaccine candidate. And when those studies with Rotashield were stopped, they switched to using the Indian vaccine candidate. It was licensed to Bharat Biotech, and they started to do studies there. But then at the time that India started to do these studies, there were all kinds of, these private company vaccines were already in the market. So then there were all kinds of ethical questions about whether you could do placebo controlled studies. That was agreed. We did a phase 3 study after consultation with WHO and many others in Delhi, Pune, and Vellore. And this was the first ever phase 3 study, a study that looked at clinical outcomes of a product developed in India. So this was a very intensive study, and what it resulted in was a vaccine that had 55% efficacy. I showed you GSK and Merck, which were 85 and 90%. This was 55%. So this was licensed by the regulatory authorities in 2014. And unlike the $200 to immunize a child, we were able to immunize children for what was then $3 per child, 3 doses of vaccine at $1 a piece. We now pay about 60 cents for a dose of rotavirus vaccine. Then there was a lot of work that we needed to do to try and figure out why Indian vaccines had only 55% efficacy. And it led us back to that same story of environmental entropy. So today, some of the work that my team and I are doing is still to try and figure out how do we make a rotavirus vaccine that works better than the ones that we have. But that's for the future. Right now, where we are in India is that we introduced the vaccine in 2016, and by the end of 2019, all of India had indigenous vaccines. There was both the Rotavac vaccine, the one that Dr. Bhan had developed. There was also a second vaccine that was developed by the Serum Institute of India. And this was a vaccine that was developed under a license from the US, but it was evaluated in both India and Africa at the same time. Now, both of these vaccines were approved by WHO in 2018. But what I want to leave you with is that in 2023, among the poorest countries in the world, 3/4 of the vaccines that are given to children to prevent rotavirus gastroenteritis are actually vaccines that are made in India. So if we think about, what Shambhunath they did, what Dilip Malinobis did, oral rehydration solution is the best option that we have for treatment of diarrheal disease. For rotavirus vaccines, Dr. Bhan's work resulted in a product that is saving children every day in India and around the world. And Dr. John's work showed us that data from India can actually change policy not only for ourselves, but also for the world. So there is the possibility of doing everything from basic science to policy in this country. And that's why I'm excited to be here at IIT, because I'm expecting some of you to be changing the world as well. Thank you.
Thank Dr. Gagandeep for such an inspiring talk, right? So we have time for questions.
You mentioned that they required 6 doses. Is it because the absorption was poor in the gut, which you have mentioned? Is that the reason? And therefore, do you think that for the rotavirus also, maybe giving more doses would work?
We actually tried this for the rotavirus vaccines. We did a trial giving 5 doses didn't really improve for the kids that were given that. For the polio vaccine, it is a lower level of replication that happens in the gut in Indian children, but lower level as a percentage of the children that receive the vaccine. Once a replication cycle gets set up, they produce the same amount of replicating virus. And the difference there is, in polio, you can infect lots of enterocytes. In rotavirus, you only infect the enterocytes at the tips of the villi. So if your villi are blunted, damage is greater and the recovery is harder for rota than for polio.
It's a wonderful talk. You highlighted on two causes of death in children, right? The lower respiratory tract infections and diarrheal causes. So, what about the lower respiratory tract infections? How are we doing there?
So for lower respiratory tract infections also, the deaths have been, so there are two ways of preventing death. One is preventing the infection itself, which is vaccination, and the other is better treatments, so that even if kids get sick, they don't die. And in both of those, we have made progress. There are a number of vaccines available for preventing lower respiratory infections in children. The pneumococcal vaccine, which was introduced into the Indian program quite recently, the Haemophilus influenza B vaccine that was introduced some years ago. Now there are new vaccines for children who have lower respiratory infections at younger ages, the respiratory syncytial virus vaccines, which can be given to mothers and babies. Those vaccines are not yet available in India.
In the all-cause global mortality slide that you showed, there was something very surprising. Most diseases had reduced from 1990 to 2021, but the malaria seemed to have gone up, and I was wondering why.
One of those is proportions, right? This is a full envelope of all the deaths. So if something else goes down, something else becomes bigger. And if you look at that, congenital conditions became bigger because the infectious causes have decreased. But malaria killing children as a proportion of deaths has not changed. Malaria, again, we have a vaccine, it's not a great vaccine. We have prevention strategies and multiple prevention strategies working, but not working to decrease the proportion of children that die of malaria.
So in the beginning, you talked about the Rome recommendations and the basic doctor concept, and you talked about these three models in CMC. So I was wondering which of those turned out to be more successful, and is something being implemented? I mean, some of those are being translated in a wider scale beyond CMC.
Well, I was actually going to end with this slide, which is Ayushman Bharat, and it looks remarkably like the CMC model. So I'm really hopeful that this starts to take off, where you actually have good primary care that prevents people from needing to use higher levels of care, which was essentially what the CMC model was about.
But not with integrated approach, right? With,
So the integrated approach worked really, really well. In terms of raising the standards of living of a rural community. But the question really is about sustainability and who winds up paying for that integrated approach.
Malaria question, since it took longer than it should have to get it, and probably my brief reading and understanding is because it's more of a problem of the East and not so much a problem of the West, right? So, so going forward, right, there'll be new diseases, there'll be more pandemics coming in. And a lot of what we have relied on is FDA certifications required for going through all sorts of regulatory approvals. going forward, for countries like India, what do you think is the right strategy in terms of balancing out the amount of time before it takes for the efficacy studies to be finished rather than actually pushing it? So are we saving? Is there a balance between actually ensuring safety versus saving lives in the long run of and other recommendations that you have for our country in particular?
So I think regulation has a very important role to play because it's assuring quality of the product that you're making. Then is also safety and efficacy, right? And so far, what we have tended to do is to play it as safe as possible. And it was easy when there were predicate products. We were following a pathway that had been approved through other regulators. But when we begin to think about innovation, everyone becomes nervous because new technology, you don't know what is safe in the short term and in the long term. So you wind up having really long cycles. The stronger a regulator is, uh, the more risk stratification, risk-based analysis they can do. But they also require for the community to be able to do that risk monitoring in the life cycle of the product. And that is something that we continue to be weak at. So you can't blame the regulator if we can't generate post-licensure data.
This is, yeah. Ma'am, you've showed basis the CMC study and also the recommendations made by Dr. Jacob John. We know that after vaccination, the vaccination coverage has improved. On the contrary, when you said about environmental enteropathy, how is the environmental risk? How has it changed? Is there any pointers towards that?
I think it's become less over time. So what we tend to do when we are looking at problems, all we can see is the problem. But if you look on a longer time scale, you can see the difference. So for example, if we look at stunting, we know that stunting has decreased from 65% to approximately 35% in India over the last, I would say, 3-4 decades. And that's progress. It's not progress as fast as we would like it to happen, but there is good things that are happening. If we look at acute malnutrition as well, in some parts of the country, very hard to find acute malnutrition in children. Unfortunately, still there in other parts. So things are changing, environments are changing. You know that, thatched huts have become rare. Most construction that is happening is actually brick. You have not mud floors as often anymore. So things are changing both in cities and in rural areas. And I hope that whatever we do, we try to accelerate that trajectory.
So I'll take the final question. So, given that we are an engineering institute, right, I was wondering what do you think are some key areas that we can contribute to?
You're an engineering institute? I heard a lot of biology today.
We are everything.
That's exactly the point. It is about, where do your skills come to bear on the problems that we have today? And there is a role for engineers everywhere. Right? Thank you all very much.
So I invite Dr.
Always a pleasure. Thank you
No,
for
no, no,
having me.
pleasure's all ours. Thank you.
you.
Thank you so much. I think your perspective is very important for us. I think the East can lead now. Thank you.
So on behalf of the Institute and the National Disease Modeling Consortium, it's my pleasure to thank Dr. Kang. It's been a wonderful experience for us to hear you speak here. So thank you so much. We are very grateful for the time and effort you put in.
Thank you.
I would also like to thank the audience, the faculty members, our students, our research associates, and also our guests from the Gates Foundation. Thank you for being an engaging participant. I would also like to thank the Institute Colloquium Committee for organizing this event. So with that, thank you once again. Please join us for tea, which is served outside.
Thank you.